when we talk about innovation, it's all about working together as a team. And so it's my pleasure to welcome Steve Potts, and he and I are going to have a little chat over lunch, and y'all get to listen in. So let's talk about accelerating health innovation, because that's something you and I are both very passionate about, and know a little bit about. You more than me. But, you know, when we think about innovation and Arizona and all of the buzz around what's happening here, you know, I came here 30 years ago. You've been here for multiple decades.
18, I think. 18, 19, yeah.
How have things changed from then to now?
Yeah, so I came here I was in the Bay Area. I did a PhD at UC Davis, 2-year penance in the Bay Area, and then about 7 years in San Diego, and moved out. My kids were young, and when I moved here, it was like I was either going to work for somebody else or I was going to have to be really entrepreneurial, because it wasn't a hub. And I knew that, you know, and so I was just, as I look back, I've kind of built a number of companies here, and there's certainly been a trend where early on they were like, especially when you go to talk to Californians, like, how the heck are you going to staff for a company like that? And you know, when even the difference, I raised about 75 million for a oncolytic virus company, 25, and then 50 million raises here that came out of ASU. That was like 6 years ago, and even then they were asking, like, well, how are you going to staff this? Are you going to bring, you know, San Diego executive team in? Are you going to? And you know, it was always the question in every discussion. And this last company, Breakthru, that we're doing now, I mean, doesn't come up at all. So the staffing certainly doesn't come up. Now, some of that's because just everyone's working more remote, but I think too we built, our reputation has increased in terms of what we can do here in the state, which is great.
You know, it's interesting. I remember coming here 30 years ago, and Arizona had one medical school.
Yeah.
Thursday, I am going to the groundbreaking for a 9th medical school.
Wow.
In 30 years. And 10 of those years was during the moratorium when you couldn't build a medical school. So it's really been, you know, accelerated past that in the last 15. And I remember, I mean, and to some extent we still have this problem. What would you say our number one life science export is?
I mean, diagnostics or devices would be that's a broad area, but I don't know. That's interesting. Students, all right. I failed that answer.
No, the reality is that thanks to the University of Arizona, NAU, GCU, we are putting out more life science undergrads and grads than the Massachusetts is with 24 Research One universities. Yeah. And unfortunately, until we start growing this sector faster, we're going to continue to export those to other places. And I don't know about you, but that's not something I want to export.
Yeah, it's interesting that I was just thinking back when I first came here, and this was in the early days when pathology was always a microscope. And I had been early on in basically digitizing and selling these scanners for a couple $100,000 to scan a microscope slide. But we had put them everywhere, and I was San Diego based. I moved out here and we basically do the exact same thing, but multiple pharma companies and said, hey, instead of having a product, can't we just be a Kinko's? Can't you do this as a service? And I mean, it's a small change. It's exactly what I was doing, but just a tiny change from selling printers to providing a service and running a Kinko's. And I was in Flagstaff, started the company called Flagship Biosciences, Flagstaff, Arizona. But the first thing we did is we went and offered to scan all the glass slides that everybody in microanatomy was doing at NAU. And that was cool because I got the professors interested, but more importantly, look at all these students that now they were much more interested in looking at a screen At the time, I used to say it was Google Earth the microscope. It was a super novel idea in 2007. Not, now we just take it for granted. But all these students now were doing it, and we could just immediately take a class of 80, 50, 40, or several sections, 30, 40 kids a section, and you find the 3 or 4 that are super into this, and that was the workforce. And so that first company, service business, pretty much doing what I was doing before, but as a service instead of a product. And we were immediately just grabbing like our best NAU students. And it's really cool because those people, that company now is about 70 person company, and it's been going year in, year out, doing services to pharma. Contract research organization is what kind of the sector calls now. But all those students now have gone on to have some great jobs in pharma. But it all started with students and just figuring out a way to how do you connect with students, get the technology into the university, and then hire right out of that. Absolutely.
And the other thing that I remember from 25, 30 years ago was, well, number one, you didn't go to downtown Phoenix after dark.
It is massively changed. My daughter is a first-year student at ASU law and doing intellectual property action in this business. I couldn't imagine having my 23-year-old daughter walking around downtown 20 years ago. Now she just loves it. Absolutely loves it.
My husband, when we first came to live here, he was working for First Interstate downtown, and I said, "Well, let's go out to dinner." He's like, "No, I'll come home." I'm like, now everybody goes out to dinner downtown.
And I think another thing is there's a lot of people in the Valley and really across the state that are some awesome, at least, I develop cancer drugs, so I have specific focus on biotech and pharma, but there's a lot of really talented people that have moved here. They're doing work elsewhere, but they're, in fact, I always think of like more networking opportunities for just people that are working remote. They're in biotech, pharma, but they're living here, working for companies all over. That's another huge change.
I mean, some of the most exciting biotech publicly traded companies that I know have senior executives living in Phoenix.
Yeah.
And so, that's an opportunity for us to tap into those networks and tap into that expertise. So, we talked about what was. And now, if we're talking about acceleration, what will be? And between alphabet innovation, right, AI, and robotics, and John Crowley likes to talk about the golden age of biotech, whatever that means, right? It sounds really good on a political talk show, but the reality is that we're starting to see changes that we didn't contemplate before. What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, so just some background. I developed cancer drugs. We've raised a company called Breakthru Medicines. I've been doing this for about 15 years. And 2 approved drugs, but then a whole ton of scars of things. For every win, you have 8 scars that you don't talk about. So, and you guys in this room know exactly what I'm talking about. But we're developing precision medicine drugs. So this is typically taking if you look at if you go to a good center for cancer today, I encourage people two reports you want to get. One is a pathology report. That's visually. Now it's on a digital slide, but it's visually what is the cancer, where does it come from, and then the next one is next-gen sequencing. And those next-gen sequencing actually originated here. It was all the work of Dan Von Hoff and colleagues, and spun out multiple companies. But now you get these reports, but you get these mutations, and there's so many of them where there's no drug to go with the mutation. So what we're working on is basically having more drug options for those mutations from these reports. What was the question? I want to make sure that understood.
How?
Yeah. So
what's accelerating
AI.
all
Yeah.
this?
So I have sort of a love-hate relationship with the use of AI. It gets thrown around a lot in this industry. Everyone's always thinking there's shortcuts. We all know if you're in medical, you are doing something that's regulatory that is going to take time, and AI is not just going to shorten those timelines. But I do think that we in almost any area of drug development that has data, for the last 2 decades has typically had machine learning applied to it. That's all the areas of chemistry, med chemistry, all the even that pathology area I talked about. That's one niche, that digital pathology, that feeds into pharma as well. All the biology areas, the cell lines, everything that has data has had several decades of machine learning type work. So I get a little annoyed when people are like, oh, AI, we're gonna shorten all the timelines. I've been using a word we kind of came up with called gray eye. And when I say gray, I don't actually mean old, because drug development can turn your hair as gray super fast. So a lot of people, young people in our business too that have gray hair. But gray eye is, I think of gray eye as this is people that have experience in drug development. And then when they use AI type things, it's really awesome, because they can really speed up. But you have to have that gray eye to do it. And in AI right now, you see a lot of promises floating around that we're shortened timelines. We could, there's a promise they'll go to investors and say, we can go from an idea in the bathtub to a development candidate, which is when you lock down the drug and you can't change it. And that's typically like a 3 to 5 year time. And they'll say, oh, we can do that in a year, 2 years. We just did it in a year, which is really cool. So we'll be in the clinic in a year. We literally went from, my chief science officer said, hey, we should do this target. I had to Google it because I never heard of it, which is also a good thing when you're trying to do something no one else is doing. But in 1 year, I went from an idea to a development candidate. And we did that with gray eye applying, but it wasn't, I give the credit more to gray eye and scars and experience than I do to the direct use of AI. I do think AI is going to have some huge impact in the regulatory. I think the clinical side of things, there's massive areas of opportunity for on the clinical operations side. And I hope, currently when you've raised money in any cancer biotech company, you typically price out about $250,000 per patient. So if you've got a 100 patient study, divide that by 4, and that's how many millions you're going to spend on the cost of the hospital, the CRO, and all the work. And so much of that is just route paperwork. And so I think the AI is going to have some awesome impact. It's already having impact on the ClinOps side of things. But the upstream stuff is harder. It's just, and we have really anywhere you can use data. We've been using data for decades. So it's a very interesting area. But at least in drug development, you can't replace gray eye with AI.
It's interesting. I was, over the holiday, my family was here, and we were talking about changes in manufacturing technology. And my father-in-law was a senior executive at Xerox. And 30 years ago, Xerox was the height of technology, one of the partners that launched the internet and networking and all of those things, and things change.
Yeah.
And so another friend that we were talking to is a radiologist, and he was saying, the opportunities for both robotics as well as the combination with AI in looking at things that the human eye just can't catch, especially when it's repetitive. And, I think we'll see those areas benefit patients. I can tell you guys, in 1978, I was working at a Chevrolet plant in Newark, Delaware, painting Chevettes by hand. If those of you aren't old enough to remember Chevette, it looked kind of like a rolling lunchbox, and it was the answer to the last oil crisis. But that's how cars were painted, on the assembly line by hand with spray guns. Now, there's not a human being in that part of the plant, it's all robots. And so we will see these changes where it makes sense and where the automation and the quality is improved from it. But I agree with you. When it comes to innovation, when it comes to diagnosis, when it comes to understanding what may or may not work, these systems are garbage in and garbage out. And, if you use some of the popular public AI platforms and you want to know about what's going on in the life sciences in Arizona, you might as well just go read the AZBio website, because that's where it's going to regurgitate all the data from, because there's 3,000 pages on the web. about Arizona from that website. So it doesn't do me any good. I don't find new data.
It's good for the synthesis.
Yeah.
Which is helpful. But I mean, even when we were taking pathology digital, there was a lot of fear from pathologists they were going to be out of jobs, and I have yet to see a single pathologist ever. Now they're working from home, but it is not. It has turned into they want to hire more of them because their profession became more quantitative. Pharma likes them more because they can actually measure stuff reproducibly. So I didn't see the job loss that some pathologists certainly were afraid of in that space. But I think like even the Xerox PARC thing. My first job out of my PhD was at Stanford Research Institute. And that was where Xerox PARC, the guy invented the mouse, did all that work. Mm-hmm. Xerox PARC kicked him out. No, sorry. SRI kicked him out there because he said there's no future in the mouse, in human interface. The guy goes over to Xerox PARC, and so Xerox PARC got all the credit. But then SRI brought him back. And so when I was there, 20 or 30 years later, Doug Engelbart would kind of shuffle around. He was probably in his 80s at that time, and he was the inventor of the mouse. It was really cool to be with him. But I think it's a great lesson for entrepreneurs because and I look back, you tend to hyper-focus on whatever you're doing, and you just miss that, you're at a meeting, you're at a convention center, and the booth next to you is just jam-packed. Like, what are they doing? Well, that's not what I do. And even that small difference from doing product-based digital pathology, selling a printer versus selling a service, tiny difference, but it was what the customers wanted. Mm-hmm. And so I think the danger we get into with entrepreneurs, you're so focused on what you're doing, and then you go to any conference, just look around and be like, why is that booth so busy? What the heck? Or even, I typically have to do about 100. My last track record was 137 no's to get that 25 million, 14 months. I ran up a bill of $120,000 funding a ASU professor, me and someone else to go travel to pitch in person before COVID, before things the VCs were not comfortable. They wanted to see you in person and scope you out. So, I ran up a $120,000 bill. My wife was like, you better get this thing closed. That's a lot of money, right? 14 months, 137 no's, 138th, 3 yeses, got the thing done. When I did the B round, it was 120 no's, 9 months. You think that would be easier because you're established, and people get to see the press release. They don't realize how many no's you've had. And so that's a challenge because how can you use that information to teach you something? Every no is a chance to be like, why didn't they want that? What would they want? And so, but it's this balance of really listening when something is hard or maybe pivoting versus just sticking to it and know that things are going to take 137 no's. I will, they used to ask Ronald Reagan, what the heck? You're an actor. What business does an actor have being president? And he said, I cannot imagine doing this job without having been trained as an actor. Now, it might, feels like 1,000 years ago, that kind of a president. But I think for entrepreneurs, I cannot imagine doing this job without having had some sales training. I mean, it is sales, and so if you haven't had sales training, one of the easiest businesses to start is distribution. You look and say, how are things flowing? Who's buying? Who's selling? And you distribute, and you really learn how things flow. Very little capital is involved. You can get 30-40% of the revenue by being a distributor. It's a great way to learn it. So if you haven't done that, if you don't have sales experience, just get in and get the experience because you're going to need it. And I can't imagine doing this job without that sales training. And again, you get the scars. People, as soon as you close it, then they're like, good job. And they're like, they don't realize that's 14 months and 137 no's, behind you. I call it Shark Tank for nerds, and kind of, you guys know what it's like.
So things are speeding up, right? Whether it's technology that's going to move us forward faster, whether it's money, talent, exits, you name it. Everybody talks about how everything's accelerating. But I've seen some pretty spectacular speed bumps in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
And, what happens when you hit those speed bumps?
Yeah, I mean, it is there's an entrepreneurial terror. I don't have to tell you what that's like because we all know what that's like. But it is like getting in a car. It's always how much gas you have, right, in the tank. And what you don't want to do when you're crossing the country, everything else is the detail. And if you're out of gas, you're out of gas, right? And every investor the smart ones are like, how much gas is in that tank? So I think of things like, someone told me this recently. There's a really good idea. He said, when do you got a great consultant and you want to bring on a full-time employee? And he said, the number one question to ask yourself is, will this full-time employee extend my runway or not? And what a great interview question too, right? You're sitting with a potential employee, you say, look, this idiot gave a talk at lunch and he said that I should only hire you if you could extend my runway. And you say, well, how are you going to extend my runway? So even if you're an employee wanting to be in this space, think about that. Like, how are you going to help me extend my runway? I do not want to run out of gas. Like, it's great, I want to develop cancer drugs, whatever, but I run out of gas in the desert, I'm going to be hosed. So, think of that. Like, how is this person going to extend my runway? Are they going to introduce me to investors? Are they going to make an amazing, are they going to be, there's three kinds of people you want to pay a lot of money for. People that can somebody that makes something so good the investors get excited. Someone that can sell. That goes without saying, right? That will certainly extend your runway. Or someone that is just like your customer. Those are the only three things you want to pay premium money for, and everything else you pay as little as you can to get it done. But ask your employer, only hire FTEs if they're going to extend your runway. It's a good way. It's a good lens, I think, for thinking of that.
So this is an election year, and we're at a 501c3 event, right? We do not endorse political candidates. But public policy is something that does shape the world around us. So, for instance, there's been a lot of instability in the risk calculation that investors look at because everything keeps changing.
Yeah.
You just raised a bunch of money. What were you hearing when you were on the road through those times?
Yeah, I mean, and this is also, I think, something I've learned is that it's actually really good to embrace just one policy topic, and you can pick it. For me, it was something called the Inflation Reduction Act pill penalty, and I can probably just walk into CNN and do a pretty good job explaining that to my mother and all the other, normal Americans in the American living room, why this is a really bad thing, and it's disincentivizing small molecules over biologics. But I embrace that one topic, and I would encourage you, do the same thing, because what it does is it really sharpens your storytelling, right? So I don't have to do everything in policy, but just embrace one policy topic and be able to explain it to the American living room. Vaccines, for example, like the importance of vaccines, whatever it is. You don't have to be expert in everything, but just, one thing that's really helpful is just be an expert in one policy topic. I remind people that, cancer is truly bipartisan. And if it wasn't, we would all switch parties. It's true, right? So, what we work on has the ability to bring people together, but only if we can really explain what we do. And that's why I think the policy thing has actually been really, in the last few years, I never thought I would talk about policy. I mean, how do you have time to talk about policy when you're trying to, fund a company and develop a drug? But it actually was really helpful for storytelling, because you just pick one particular area of policy. Maybe it's vaccines, maybe it's the Inflation Reduction Act, maybe it's intellectual property, whatever it is, and just get really good at telling that story, and it'll help you also just with your overall pitches for raising money too.
Yeah. So, it's amazing to me that it's been it'll be 30 years next year since Jane Hull said we need to focus on the biosciences in Arizona.
Yeah.
And I miss her. I mean, she was such a visionary person, and our state needs visionaries right now, more than ever. As you look out across that horizon, what are some of the greatest opportunities you see for Arizona?
Yeah, I'm intrigued by a number of things. again, thinking of watching trends and things that just surprise you here. Like, I'm really surprised that, 2 miles from where I mountain bike up in northern Phoenix, there's this incredible, Taiwanese manufacturing plant, the largest foreign investment in history, I believe, 2 hours from my house. Now, some of the trails are going to get, paved over, which we're not happy about, but it's amazing to have them there. But I think of like how good Taiwan is in clinical trials. They're really good. And I think about how good we are here in Arizona at clinical trials, and I keep thinking, how do you leverage what, now we have direct flights to Taiwan. Taiwan is a center. I was with John Crawley at a private meeting in kind of a think tank of how to think about U.S. versus China, et cetera. And an obvious one was strengthen ties with Taiwan. We're doing that more than any other state in the nation right now. How do we increase that? And it isn't necessarily a technical thing. Like, it's not just like, how do we make a biochip and connect AI with what the Taiwanese plant is doing. It's also just a human connection. Like, how do we build a really good Taiwanese to Arizona? I think we got to start to it, but how do we do more of that? That's something I think is super interesting. I think of all the cancers, there's just really, really good cancer centers here. And I think we're going to see more and more of that, I hope, coming out. And I think having the med school here, so we just have a long history in diagnostics and cancer. And, so I think we'll see some more opportunities there. And I think the AI, there's some really, I'm seeing a lot of talent moving in here. ASU's always been good at software and producing really smart, kids with software, talent. I think there's a chance to do even more in the AI, kind of the bio AI space. But again, pick the boring stuff. Like people say like, oh, AI and drug development, as if I'm gonna AI is gonna invent a new drug for me. That's the sexy stuff. Like, have AI fix the problem that I'm spending $250,000 damn dollars per patient on these drug trials? Is AI all over that? Pick the boring stuff that someone else isn't doing. It's a great way to build successful businesses. So I think AI is going to do some really good stuff there too.
Cool. Last closing thought.
Yeah, I think it's so cool having a room full of entrepreneurs. Seriously, so we all get to experience entrepreneurial terror at night and until we stop being entrepreneurs. So, I'm just like, what would I wish someone would tell me, to my younger self, or maybe don't do it, but other than that, I think number one is, I'll leave you just closing thought. One is like, nothing is personal. Everything, if you just immediately say, everything is my responsibility, it actually lets you let things go, because you're like, well, of course, it's my company. It's all my fault. So that's good. But, nothing is personal. And someone said, Steve, if you ever start taking things personally as a biotech CEO, you're hosed. Mm-hmm. I was like, yeah, that's a good point. So I think that was really helpful. I think, people ask me a lot about fundraising. And I'm sure half the people in the room are probably thinking about, how do I fundraise? And, you've got the family office, you've got the venture capitalists. And I kind of joke, I said, and they say, well, how do you get money from family offices? And one of the things we've done is actually go around the biotech VCs to the people they get money from, which is I hope there's no VCs in the room, but the limited partners above the VCs. And, and there's a number of things we had to put in place to be able to do that. But, people say, well, how do you get money from these family offices? How do you get money from these high net worth people? How do you get money from these LPs that fund, venture? And I said, there's only two things. And so if you were a billionaire and you exited and you're going to film your own family office, there's only two things you would ever spend money on, right? Two things. One is whatever you made money on before. So if you're in real estate, you spend money on real estate. That's one of the challenges here is very few of the very high net worth people have made their money in biotech or drug development or diagnostics. So it's tough to get a real estate guy to go spend money on drug development. And then the other thing they're going to spend money on is someone they already know. So if Steve comes in there and is like, hey, you don't know me, and I'm going to tell you about cancer, strike at least 2 strikes, I'm out. So you just think about that, and it helps you put yourself in their shoes of, okay, how do I lessen that risk? How do I make cancer drug development something that's more understandable, and maybe put it into terms they might understand if they come from a real estate background? And then how do I have enough, work enough to have my network enough so that I really do have people in common with them, and they can trust that I'm going to, do something really great, with their funding.
Cool. So, what do you think, guys? Shall we say thank you to Steve?